episode 160. This is one of our hosts' Reflect episodes, where we ponder on some of the recent episodes, but also look ahead at different trends and events that are going on in education. Today, with me, Chris Deedy from Harvard, is Yang Zhao from the University of Kansas and the University of Melbourne, and Punya Mishra from Arizona State University. Our fourth co-host, Kurt Bonk, is out and about somewhere. So we could spend the episode talking about him, but I think instead we will choose to focus on educational themes. Either one of you two want to start?
Yeah, I think, the last episode was kind of fun and funny in many ways. We had two kind of polyglots, who are supposed to speak many languages. I've always wondered, and of course, there are historically a lot of, quite a number of people who could do a lot of languages. And then recently I was reading articles about should, with ChatGPT and AI and all the automatic translation software, what's the value of doing that? Actually, I wrote a blog post a few months ago for the Australian Asian Education Foundation, which has been promoting second language learning, challenging the idea to say, learning a second language, basically, by the way, is not a bad thing. Learning a third language is not a bad thing. The more languages you can learn, it's a good thing. But, if you look at our K-12 schools, not many schools succeed in teaching a second language. In fact, many, many years ago, I think there's a professor out of University of Southern California who said, successful second language learning is only of pathological value. That means that not many people succeed, so here we had two people speaking multiple languages. Now you wonder the value of time, because you want to, there's one thing in learning that you can't escape. That is spending the time. So human beings have really, I think time is a constant. If you spend time learning another language versus spending time learning something different, we can claim the value of learning anything might be valuable, but how are we spending time? So that really got me to think about what is worth spending time on. As you probably know, at the beginning of Industrial Revolution, I think, oh God, I forgot his name, Spencer, Herbert Spencer wrote the article that's about 150 years ago now called, What's Worth Learning, or what's worth teaching, what's the most worthwhile subject. So anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting to think about.
So Zhao, I'm going to build on that. First, I'm going to push against it a little bit in terms of thinking of learning just as something that has value in the sense of like immediate value. So there is, what was interesting about these two guys was that they were just passionate about learning languages, and they've figured out a way of making a living doing that, which I think is awesome, right? Whether it works for everybody is not the point, as much as what I was impressed by is that they took something that was, so I think this should appeal to you because you often speak about the idea of following, figuring out your being entrepreneurial in education and learning. And I think they are sort of a little bit following what you have been sort of making a point over the years, which is that there are many different possibilities in the world out there. And, could they have done this 20 years ago? No, I think they were a bunch of talented, a couple of talented young people who had this one pet passion and happened to live in a world where there is YouTube and TikTok and took advantage of it. I think that's actually quite impressive in that regard. But I want to make a connection. The one episode that really, really touched me in a very deep way was the Little Bookmates one, which Chris, you were instrumental in bringing. And for those who are listening, I ended up writing like a pretty extensive blog post about sort of love of learning, because it brought back a bunch of memories of me growing up in India and a movie by Satyajit Ray. And then Zhao pushed me like, okay, what's the story that your mother wrote and what's the movie clip? So I lost 2 days of my life digging that stuff out. But it was a very, I think the connection between the two to me is that personal one, which is that learning at the end of the day is deeply personal. And that yes, we should be looking at what it means for, how much time we spend on X or Y, and what benefit return on investment we get. But I think what stood out between those two episodes for me was how deeply personal learning is, and how the little bookmates, what they talked about in how much reading books meant to them, right? And how they decided to take that and build this infrastructure that allowed people to kids to read, and also like this sort of very simple insight out of which that model is built, which is, I don't know what the number they gave was, but that 90% or 95% of books in the world are actually sitting in shelves in somebody's house. I mean, here we go, right? And how often am I pulling them out and reading them? And there could be possible value in books being exchanged and so on. But I think, to me, what really stood out in those two and why they sort of were meaningful to me personally was because they both spoke to the personal value of learning, and which to me goes, I mean, again, it's not an either or. I don't think that it is an either or, but we often don't talk about that. We often talk about it in terms of resources and money and time and return on investment and so on. While I think that learning and education are much more than that in some way. They're sort of intrinsic to who we are as a species. And I think those two episodes sort of really spoke very deeply and personally to me in different ways.
Punya, I love what you said. By the way, I loved your blog post about your mother's the story. I just want to, I think you just want to highlight, respond to what you said, is that the two guys who speak a lot of languages definitely fits my thinking about learning. What I don't want it is people say, oh, let's have everybody learn more than 3 languages. So that's what I worry about. I love it. They loved it. They made a living. But actually, I saw this news yesterday on CNN. CNN is not only about Trump nowadays. So they had the CNN heroes.
Wait
so
till next week.
You saw the one guy, I think it's an African American, who's been distributing books to barbershops because he saw a lot of young African American youth who are raised by single mothers, many of them, and they go to barbershops, and then when they get haircut, at least they have a chance to read some book, to see a book. I love that. It really relates to the little book project which Chris brought to us, from Mexico. Like you said, I think again, making resources available to people, I think is just one of the things that all education should do. But again, making resource available is not the same as forcing people to do different things. One of the problems I think schools do is schools are scripted to force people to do certain things, instead of allowing people to do different things. So anyway, that was just I by the way, everyone should read Punya's that little blog. It's just fascinating. Chris?
Well, I like this theme about learning for the sake of learning and for personal satisfaction of different kinds, because one of the things the educational system does is all learning becomes instrumental. You're learning so that you can do X, you can get a good job, you can get into the right college, you can do this, you can do that. And the subtext of that is that students are basically taught that if you don't have a purpose for learning, don't waste your time doing it. And in fact, learning is one of the things that makes people happy and satisfied with their lives when they learn something that they care about and enjoy without worrying about whether it's instrumental beyond that. And I too like the Little Bookmates a lot, and part of why I like it is because there is a clear focus on involving the whole family, not just the child, and using it as a kind of bonding time, and also a time of just celebrating, enjoying the act of reading. It isn't that the content is that important. It isn't that it matters whether the parents are using phonics or whole language comprehension. It's just to enjoy reading. And I think that often what happens in schools is, first, a lot of kids don't learn to read, which is tragic. And second, even the ones that do don't like to read. In part, that's because of they were taught it instrumentally and, kind of marched through it. And in part because it's the stuff that they are asked to read is not personalized. It's not of any great interest to them. It may even be, I find a lot of those books that kids are asked to read difficult and boring, difficult motivationally. So I think that making reading a joy has a big payoff and may, in fact, result in more kids learning to read than elaborate programs of phonics and elaborate programs of the science of reading and so on. Not that those aren't worthwhile, but that motivation ultimately is at the heart of this. Same thing with languages. I want to differentiate between knowing a language well enough to be able to go into a bar and have a conversation, which was kind of the polyglot level that we were hearing about, and knowing a language so that you're actually thinking in that language and you see the world through the lens of that language, which all native speakers have for one language, but takes some considerable investment and probably interaction with native speakers in a different language to really begin to think in that language and to use it as a lens for the world. But that's the more ways that you can think, at least up to some number, the better, because now you've got a shift in perspective, which Alan Kay said is worth 80 IQ points, and I think that's probably true. So I think at least learning two languages deeply, as not so that you can go to the country and speak it, which is instrumental, but that so you can see the world through that lens, in which maybe objects have gender and there are cultural dimensions, even in the way that you express things. That can be exciting. That can be a joy in and of itself. And so we can celebrate, part of what we can celebrate is people that recognize the motivational dimensions of learning, and B, people that understand that at the end, it's really not only instrumental, it's about self-actualization in the deepest sense.
Chris, there are 2 points I really think again, it's really worth pondering. One is the when you talk about reading, I'm trying to remember as Punya, when I was a kid in a very impoverished village, I was probably the only one who was very interested in reading. But reading gave me a new space to imagine things beyond my village, things that I wasn't able to understand completely at all, but allowed me to play in my mind something different, and which relates to what you're talking about, the second language. I guess Punya and I both are at least bilingual. Punya, you may be trilingual, you may be, I don't know how many quadrilingual, I don't know how many languages you speak.
Depends on how many drinks I've had when I'm at that bar.
Well, I don't go to a bar.
Once I've had 3 or more, I can speak in any language with anybody.
Well, but the thing is that, what Chris said is really interesting, is being able to think like now, I don't know what language I think, Chinese, or English. But I can access both languages at ease. If there's a Chinese person who can only speak Chinese, another American who speaks only English, I can have a conversation with both at the same bar, table, or just hang out. It's just quite interesting. And the process, I think what Chris emphasizes is important, is again, allow you to access something foreign, allow you to get into a space which it's not possible. So brings back to my question to all of us is, imagine children from disadvantaged families, from people who cannot travel, who don't travel, from rural areas. And today with TikTok, with YouTube, do they engage in the same way as we would with another language or with a book, when you are truly isolated? So I'm just curious about, from the media perspective, does like TikTok give every child the same thing as books did to some children many, many years ago? Punya?
So I really like this line of thinking, because clearly these media are appealing in some way or the other, and they're opening windows into the world. So I think here's the thing. If I think about the books that were around me when I was growing up, right? And I would love to hear both of your experiences, like, because there is a selection process that is there, right? That either somebody deliberately or by chance. So maybe it's some books that were lying around in your village that you first saw. In my case, there were books at home, and there was sort of a push towards, oh, you can read, this is a good book, this is not, so there is that dialogue that's going on. And then after that, you pick up your own. The interesting thing that's happening, I think, with the social media thing is that the selection process is being determined by a multinational whose best interests are not your growth and development, but whose best interests are engagement and sticking with the platform, right? And so TikTok, for instance,
no, I have to jump in here.
Yeah.
Because what happened is, when I was growing up, there was the big corporation, it's called the Chinese Communist Party. So that's the only book they're promoting is Chairman Mao's works. My father was given 5 volumes of Chairman Mao's speeches. And so their interest was promoting Chairman Mao. And I was reading all the Chairman Mao's works and the footnotes. Mao uses a lot of historical footnotes. That was very interesting. But anyway, go on. I just had to I couldn't resist.
No, that's good. That's good. No, that's good. So that, which means that there always is a selection at some level or the other. I mean, that example of my mother's story of this villager coming and listening to a 9-year-old blabbering whatever they know, right? I mean, she gives a really nice list of examples, like what's the function of the Red Cross and what is gravity? And, I mean, it's like he's just soaking it up. And I think that at that age, when you're reading Chairman Mao or whatever you're reading, you're just soaking it up because it is something that is helping you think, and there's something that intrinsically, but there is a selection process there. And I think what you managed to do was break out of that and say, oh, there is more to this. And there must be in a moment where you read something else and you're like, oh, maybe this is not the story that everybody believes. I mean, I remember there are moments in my life where reading something or thinking something, and I'm like, so maybe what my parents are telling me or what the world is telling me isn't all correct, and that there is more. And that's a great incentive, to learn new things. And then it becomes like this one-upmanship in some way. It's like, oh, I remember in chemistry, there was this one teacher of ours who was really quite clueless, and I would actually read ahead so that I could make a fool of him. I mean, that was an incentive to learn. I mean, which is a dumb incentive at some level, like a really mean incentive, but it worked for me. It was fine, because then I would ask him questions about stuff and he wouldn't know, because it was like from 2 weeks ahead of what we were covering right now. And he was barely keeping up with what was happening. But the point I'm making is different. Like, the point I'm making is that 2 things. One, different media have different ways of engagement, interaction. A book at some fundamental level is a very personal journey. It is introspective. It is self-paced. It's words on a page. That's a different way of interaction than with media, which is much more, I mean, this is like going back to McLuhan and Postman and things that way. So one point is there, that there are differences between this media. One, like McLuhan calls them hot and cold. So I've been thinking a lot about this with respect to different, social media and AI and so on. Like, what are the propensities of that medium? So that's one. The second is, how is the selection being done? And I think what is happening in the social media space, the selection is, so whatever might be your father giving you Chairman Mao's books, were not to convert you to communism, but as much as to, oh, here's a young kid, I need to give, it was with your best intentions at heart. Well, I don't think that these media companies have the education and literacy and so on of the young people at heart. They will have to override it, the algorithm, in some way, in order to find the things that are genuinely worth learning for them and personally connected and so on. So I think there are two pieces there. The nature of the medium, I think, is one, and second is how that selection is happening. And I think that the selection that happens in social media is much more about eyeballs and making you stick to the platform. Like, what I've heard is TikTok basically can tell within 8 seconds whether you are going to watch this video or not, and starts making predictions based within 8 seconds. So it's deeply reverse engineering our brain to figure out what we want to watch more of, irrespective of whether it's good or bad or whatever, right? So I think those are two things we need to think about when we think about the nature of media and learning and literacy.
Well, and what I would add to that is that grain size is important, time is important. So a lot of social media is like a one-sentence book. And I'm not saying that there can't be value to a one-sentence book. In fact, it's kind of fun to think about writing a book that's one sentence long. I meant to leave the bar by the door, but I exited by the window. That's an interesting one-sentence book. It can evoke a lot of different things. When I woke up in the morning, I discovered I'd become a giant cockroach. That's actually a one-sentence summary of a famous literary novel. But the point is that that's not the same as reading 250 pages that richly and deeply illuminate multiple themes. And if the whole world were filled only with one-sentence books, it would be a terrible loss. And that's part of what makes me nervous about social media, is that people think that if they've experienced 60 different things in the same amount of time that it took them to do one thing deeply, that they're 60 times better off somehow. And I think, if anything, the opposite might be true.
I've not played with TikTok. I've been playing with TikTok's father. It's called Toutiao. It's headlines. It's like an app from China. That's the company that started TikTok. And it's basically getting a lot of people to write the one-sentence book. And what's interesting, I play with it. So depends on the first video you pick, it will push different video. Then after 2 days, I get so tired of that type of video. So I go pick another one. So they are very smart. So they have certain random things. And, people, I don't know about others. I get tired of, the same thing, after a day or two, I got to go do something else. So I think the ideas, which, Chris, what you trigger me in thinking about Punya's thinking, is that not only they manage to feed you what you want, one-sentence books actually convinces you that there are only one-sentence video, because a lot of the video is no more than 3 minutes. It just convinces you. So it does not give you, as I said, the external space for you to imagine. Because a book, well, think about Harry Potter, I know that's controversial as well, but think Lord of the Rings, right? If you read the book, you do create different images, but it's long enough to create actually a story, a narrative. And I think this one sentence never gives you that depth, but just makes you happy, you just flip through it, you really flip through, like in a minute or in 30 seconds. And it's just quite fascinating. I think we do need to think about if children were only learning from the one sentence book or one sentence books, what kind of future would they have?
You know, we could do Silver Lining for Learning in a different format. We could do SLL Light, where every day we did an episode where each one of us had one sentence and then we signed off. And so it would be like, what do these four clowns have to say today? And, oh, okay, hey, that was interesting. And then the next day, another thing. I wouldn't want to participate in that because I don't think we do anything deeply enough to be worthwhile. But that's actually a better fit.
You would have
We
more
would
viewers,
probably
right?
increase our viewership if we had something like that. Oh, while my coffee is brewing, I think I'll get a little hit of Silver Lining for Learning.
Well, I think a lot of people would watch a Harvard professor drinking coffee and making coffee. I think that would attract a lot of audience, just think about that. But actually, that's the same thing. If you think about the time, go ahead, Punya.
No, so we have a new guest on our YouTube channel, Fenton Hughes, and he sort of asks a really nice question about like that when we are talking about media, we can talk about films and what films do, which is different from, let's say, a novel. And he says that Gary Saul Morrison from Northwestern writes about how the novel is a uniquely powerful way to learn morality because you get to enter into the protagonist's mind. And I think that's a really interesting one to think about, because if you go back, and I remember reading this somewhere, where if you go back, let's say to the epic like Beowulf and things that way, there was very little discussion of the interior life of the individual. So the novel, when it comes out, is in some weird way sort of an output, a byproduct of the advent of printing and publishing, where novels, there is this inward turn that happens. When you start, so the great example that you give of Kafka of the Metamorphosis, so, where Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning and finds he's a cockroach. And nothing really happens in that story. It's all about the internal sort of workings of the mind. And I think that novels do a phenomenal job of that. Like the great novelists manage to get into the minds of the different characters, and in ways that film cannot do, because film is always sort of on the surface. And that is a different kind of a medium, and it does a good job in its own way when done well, right? Good films, good novels. But I think that's a really good point about the nature of medium. And I think what we are seeing with social media, with sort of TikTok and so on, is sort of these snippets, which are evocative and powerful, but don't necessarily allow for that being the other, being in somebody else's shoes or mind, looking at the world through that, and truly genuinely confronting sort of the moral, ethical dilemmas that we live with. And because books become, for me, I often think that I led my life based on books that I read. Like choices I made were based on books that I read. It's kind of interesting to think of it that way, that it allowed me to think of parallel lives and make choices. And I'm not sure how much these media allow for that kind of decision making, and how much of it is more of the algorithms making certain decisions for you, even if it might be random at some level, right? But still, it's being determined by someone else. Anyway, good points.
Well, Fent, I'm really happy that you joined us, Fent. I've greatly enjoyed knowing Fent when he was in our master's program, and he's a wonderful alumnus and raises a really good issue.
Yeah, he's been listening for 2 years but never joined live. So hey, welcome.
So I'll build on this a little bit because yes, some novels are written so that you're in the mind of the protagonist. And what's really interesting is when somebody takes a kind of a cultural meme and riffs on it from a different way of thinking. So I remember in graduate school, actually, I think I was an undergraduate, reading John Gardner's novel that looked at Beowulf through the eyes of the monster. And that was really fun to see Beowulf through the eyes of the monster. I remember Durrell's Alexandrian Quartet, where you actually have the same thing from 4 different perspectives, each one novel length. And so it's just a very rich reminder that, like the movie Rashomon, that the same reality may take on very different forms depending on who is interpreting it. And again, you can't get that in any depth with TikTok or modern social media, because they're all sort of bite-sized in a way that doesn't allow you to go deeper.
There's another thing I would just want to bring out. I never experienced this, but I think Chris, you have. Listening to radio as a family, right? Family together listening to radio stations. When I was growing up, we had just an hour, 2 hours a day of loudspeakers broadcast by the commune. And now with the podcast, you can download, you can listen, you can have a choice. So listening to podcast typically takes longer. You cannot do a podcast, TikTok. You don't really listen to something for 1 minute, right? You listen to. So I was just wondering, especially in Pune, going back to you listen to a lot of podcasts. You create a lot of podcasts. So how would you compare those things for learning? And another point I was going to make is the idea. When Pune, I'm glad you added, but great novelist, not everyone writes, because now novels are written to meet different needs too. Like today, even people read, we call them network writers. Their writing is so different from what the great novels you guys were referencing, it's different. So I was just wondering, Pune, you or Chris, you guys have any reaction to what I was thinking about?
So podcasts are a great example. In fact, one of the big things that I missed because of my surgery, because I wasn't going for walks with the dog, that's my time for listening to podcasts. And I wasn't driving to work, which was my time for listening to podcasts. And I have found I really like podcasts which are long form and conversational. That's why, like the Ezra Klein show, I love the New York Times one. It's really, really good. They get good guests. There are good in-depth conversations. I come out of it learning a little bit, getting a little bit more insight on whatever the topic that is being discussed. I'm not so much of a fan of sort of the short snippet ones, because again, for this reason, because you can't get into any depth in any idea. There is no unpacking of an idea and its consequences and so on. So yeah, so now that I've started walking again, I'm getting back to my podcast because I miss them. They've become a really key part of my life. So yeah.
Well, the radio television distinction is an interesting one, because again, going back to McLuhan, radio is a cool medium. You're just hearing the voice, and you have to create all the rest of the experience in your mind. And even if you're listening with your family, each of you may have a different vision of what's going on. Television is a hot medium, and everybody sees the same thing. And there's strengths and weaknesses to each approach, but certainly you develop a deeper imagination with radio than you do with television.
Well, the joke is that the pictures are better on radio. And truly, right? Because you're imagining it,
See, I remember in China, one of the early things become very popular was radio-based novels. So you have those narrators who really read novels as a performance. That would become so popular. That's before kind of TV got popular in China. It was really recreating a new image. So how is that different from you reading a novel? Because again, when you're reading a novel, especially when you're from extremely impoverished areas, you can't even imagine. For example, the ocean, the waves, and just imagine those things. So when you're reading from an inland area or from a desert area, how do you imagine that? How do you create those things? I think it's just fascinating. Like what is an ocean?
So, quick question: do either of you do audiobooks at all?
Yes, that's the point I was just coming to.
Okay,
But
so Chris, I want to hear your take on audiobooks, and then I'll give you mine.
well, I find that I enjoy both reading a book and listening to the audiobook. And some of that is because a skilled narrator can really make the characters come to life, even just the voices, in a different way than I might have played those voices in my mind when I was reading. And so it's interesting to get the different perspective on it. Some of it is that I'm a very fast reader, and that can mean that I read so fast that I miss some of the nuance. And with an audiobook, I'm stuck. I can't see the next word. I have to go slowly because I'm at the mercy of the narrator. And so I get things that I didn't get when I was reading. So I think they complement each other in a lot of interesting ways.
Okay, that's cool, because I cannot stand audiobooks because I'm a fast reader. The only time I remember, this was this novel, I was like, okay, I need to start doing audiobook. People I knew, who I respected and whose opinions are valued, were all doing audiobooks. So I remember checking one out from the library. This is way back when they would be on like CDs or something. And I got so frustrated. I went to the library, found the actual book, read it, and I was like, okay, now I'm done. I'm never ever doing an audiobook again, because it was just so darn slow. And I could have gone, so much faster. And again, coming back to the issue of time, but it was frustrating to me because I knew I could have, not that I wanted to speed read it, but I wanted to read it at my pace, which was more than what the narrator was doing. And I got so I've
But
never
that's
ever done
funny,
audiobooks after
California,
that.
because podcast is in a sense a form of audiobook, right? I mean, if you printed out the text, you transcribed it, you read it, what's the difference? For example, it's very hard for me actually to listen. I love reading, like it's very difficult for me to listen to someone. I like reading a lot more, a lot different. So how would you read the transcript of something which you can do much faster?
Sure, and I do that.
So, podcast, right?
Yeah, so podcast for me is when I'm doing something else that I cannot read. So when I'm walking, when I'm driving, I cannot read at that time. So I will listen to a podcast. So it's using the time that way. But if I'm sitting at my computer and I'm looking up something from the Ezra Klein show, I will never listen to it. I will try and find the transcript and just skip it.
That's like me.
Oh, sure.
I just don't like. So I'm very well. I never got used to listen to audiobooks. In life you're supposed to pick them, but I can't. I think I'm too old to enjoy anything of new media. That's another point I just want to really bring out to this idea about learning and entertainment. So when you guys were talking about reading Beowulf and all those things, so a lot of times like novels were read, of course, deeply you were thinking about exploring morality, ethics, all of those. But on the other hand, a lot of people read novels for entertainment. And the entertainment piece, I think it is the same thing with, again, TikTok, YouTube, all those things. So what is learning? What is entertainment? Because sometimes in education, we get to a higher level, we think everything is learning, right? But human beings seek entertainment as well. And so, I remember when my kids were growing up, I had a very difficult time if they were not reading a book, which we view books as learning, TVs or playing video games as entertaining. There are a lot of people writing about, of course, TV and video games can also be learning resource as well. So I was just wondering, what do you guys think about that?
Well, I think that there's different kinds of entertainment. So one of the little clips that I use sometimes in my course at the end is a clip that's about 2 minutes long. It's on YouTube, and it talks about Joseph Campbell and his book, The Hero's Journey. And it points out that every big blockbuster Hollywood movie has exactly the same plot. And it has 12 different stages of the hero's journey. And it illustrates this with all of the major super movies in the last 20 years. And you see that it's true, that these are all different ways of expounding on the hero's journey with different contexts and different personalities cast as the hero. So that's entertainment that's actually dealing with very deep themes about what it means to be human, the cultural mythos that we live in. And there's other entertainment that's just, has no redeeming social value at all. I mean, my family and I watch a show that no longer is around, unfortunately, called Holy Moly, which is like competitive mini golf. And it's watching people make fools of themselves on a very complex golf course. It has no redeeming social value. There's no deep statements about the human condition. It's just silly. But sometimes you just want to be silly, and you're not trying to learn anything. If anything, you're trying to distract yourself from all the tough things in the world that you're learning the hard way. So I think there's reading and there's entertainment, and it's really a spectrum rather than a binary contrast.
So one of the things that Steven Pinker talks about in one of his books is that novels, if you think about it, like humans are social beings, right? So we want to understand and interpret other people's actions, intentions, beliefs, desires, so that we can, figure out what's going on. How do I get what I want, in that situation? It's always about building these sort of connections and alliances. And I don't mean it in some kind of a dog-eat-dog world kind of way, but being with people is partly that, right? Is a big part understanding what's going on. And he talks about novels and stories as being simulations of understanding how to be in the world, how to be in a social world. And I think that's sort of a really powerful way of thinking, because a huge part of our brain is devoted to that social aspect, because it's very complicated. And so that becomes entertaining. So if you think of a show like Succession, or if you think of a show like Breaking Bad, I mean, what they're doing is really bringing out the complexities of human interaction through dialogue, through filmmaking, and so on. I mean, that's why those are really powerful and good entertainment, because they're entertaining, but in a way that allows us to understand people's intentions and power dynamics and differences of perspective and miscommunication and the consequences of that miscommunication. Those are things that are inherently interesting to us. So we will spend hours of our life, trying to figure out why, or like thinking about why did that person not say hello to me when I crossed them in that corridor? Was it because that email that went through and I did a reply all by me? I mean, we will create this thing in our head. That's human, right? To do that. And I think what novels and films and good cinema and good television and storytelling does is allow us to think of those conflicts in sophisticated and complicated ways, because they are inherently tickling that aspect of our brain, which is that social brain.
Well, theories of mind. So that's what
makes absolutely
us. Human beings always try to guess what happens. Human beings are always trying to make sense of something. I remember.
So Zhao, do you remember, this was my first semester when we taught this class called New Age Media and a Stone Age Mind. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Wow, that takes us back to 1998 or 99.
98, I think, but the funny thing is this. We start this episode by talking about imagine something beyond, but also we convert something beyond into your own life. I don't think many people have seen this. I actually saw it because I again came out of a tiny village. So when the village had TV, I went back. They watched TV of lives of human beings living in big cities. They could not understand, but they laughed at their exactly the different points than the city people. So they had two different versions, the same TV drama, but they had two different versions. You see people from one group, they really interpreted it so differently from what the author intended or from what's supposed to be, because they don't understand. Like one of things, I remember clearly, it's called nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons, if you translate into Chinese, is we call 核武器. But that 核 means, nuclear makes sense, but 核 also means black. So in the countryside, people had no idea about what that nuclear weapon is. So they just interpreted this weapon was black, was made out of coal, must be very, very powerful. So that was, I said, how do they do that? It's just fascinating how we force things into our own mind. And you don't know. I mean, I'm sure they would never know. How would you explain that? With illiterate people watching TV about this big pictures. So that was just always kind of struck me as something fascinating.
So, there's this piece called Shakespeare in the Bush, which is this anthropologist is like, oh, Shakespeare is our greatest literary tradition, Western tradition. So he takes Shakespeare's stories and he tries to tell them to these people in the Kalahari that he's working with, like it's part of his anthropological thing. And it is such a hilarious sort of documentation of cultural difference in interpreting a story. So things which are like fantastical in Shakespeare, like the ghost showing up, are taken as being totally normal in some way. But other things like, oh, this is just a dumb thing this person did. Why did they think that the fathers would be blah, blah, blah? And it's just a wonderful sort of examination of cultural differences and the narratives that we create, and that we essentialize them in some way because we think that's the way things are. But I think this is coming full circle back to the point that Chris made in the beginning with regard to language, that learning a language is more than communicating in a bar. It is about inhabiting a culture. And so coming back again, Zhao, to what you started with, which is now with these large language models and so on, why would we need to learn a language? I think if you think about language as communicating a balance sheet or communicating like an email message about when do we schedule a meeting, fine. But if it goes to things like nuclear and coal and things like Shakespeare in the Bush, I think things get more interesting. And to me, I really just want to sort of underline what Chris said about the value of inhabiting a different space, and recognizing. Like, I'll give you an insight that I had very recently that, if you meet somebody from India, like if you're there, like two Indians meet, they will ask, so they'll ask me my name, I'll say my name is Punya, and they'll ask me, what is your good name? And yes, you'll find the Indians always ask, what is your good name?
What's a good
typically
name?
They'll ask, yes, so typically they'll ask that to other Indians, right? And it took me till I was 50 some years old to realize that it is a way of finding out your caste.
What is a good name?
Yeah, so no, my good name would be Punya Mishra, right? Mishra promptly tells people what caste I am. And so asking people, because if you ask somebody, that people in India have nicknames. So my name may be Punya Mishra, but people call me Bobby. Like that's what my mom used to call me. So if somebody asks me, oh, I am Bobby, and then people ask me, what is your good name? And that is code for what caste are you?
Well, I was asked by Australian American, said, what's your Christian name? I said, why would I have a Christian name? And that really confused me. I didn't even know what a Christian name is. I had no, but he was very insistent I should have a Christian name. But anyway, that was just a different story.
I know lots of Asian who have, who would be young Zhao, but call me, I know, Joe, right?
Is that a Christian name?
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
Well, Chris would know.
Christian name
is the real expert.
The Christian name is a name that you were baptized with. Which, of course, assumes that you were baptized. Right? That's why it's called Christian, is that it's like your baptized name. I'm not advocating for this. I'm just giving you a descriptive answer about it.
No, I get it. So
every America had a Christian name?
Well, no. I mean, often the name that you're baptized with is the name on your birth certificate. Yeah, I'm just trying to explain where the Christian comes from.
Okay, so can I change the topic a little bit? I think it's
No more
related.
Christian names. Okay, go
No,
ahead.
no, no. I'm going to change the topic a little bit. So coming back to this idea of the social brain, right? That's a huge part of our evolutionary heritage of trying to figure out people and their beliefs and desires. That is deeply inherently motivating. I've been thinking about AI, Chris. You and I have talked about this. Has been around for a long time. It's been in the algorithms that Google uses to, autocorrect my email. It is in photo face recognition that Google Photos or Apple does. It's been around us. Why did ChatGPT and these large language models pick up in the collective imagination so powerfully? And I think it's because of this, which is that they use language, and that kicks in our theory of mind, and we start engaging in sort of anthropomorphizing these tools in really powerful ways. And I think that's what's made them so attractive. As long as they remain in the realm of the algorithm and I couldn't interact with it one-on-one like a human, it wasn't very attractive, right? So GPT-4.3 came out and people are talking about it, and it was like, fine, you could go in and write some code or whatever you could do with it. But it's only when it came out as a language model that you could have it as a chatbot, sorry, to be specific. The moment it came out as a chatbot is when it just blew up. And part of the reason I think is because it's tickling that social brain of ours. And I wonder down the road what implications that has when we have these agents which are clearly not human interacting with us. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about. What does it mean for us as a species? What does it mean for education and all of those things? So I'm just curious to hear what you guys think about this.
Well, Puni, I think we should. I've been going back to reading evolutionary psychology. I was reading a lot of that. You came up with this idea that they are kind of. We do have the old Stone Age brain to deal with. Remember, you were talking about the research at Stanford. They were talking about they tried
Reeves and Nash and Reeves, the media equation stuff. Yeah.
Think about all those. I think now it's actually a better time to think about that, right? Machines perform a lot more like that. And there are people. I was talking to some education technology people. They said, okay, how do we make using AI to provide social emotional support? And there are AI-driven robots used in what's nurseries, for people who don't have children to come to visit them, like those. And so how do you, I think it's very easy to move your emotions to an object. I was saying, I said, well, kids develop that with a blanket, right? A blanket. Now, if we have a talking blanket, how would the kids change that? So that actually is really very interesting to me to say, will people become more socially distributed to make friends with AIs or AI-driven robotics? So how would that change? And then we talk about tutoring, right? If AI can tutor people, I saw a company from India developing called personalized tutor based on ChatGPT. So they're trying to tutor individuals. Would you develop any emotional connection with the tutor or social psychological response to the tutor as you would to a person? If ChatGPT tells you, oh, your writing is no good, how is that different from a teacher tells you your writing is no good? I think it's just really just worth exploring, but I haven't seen much. And so that's why I was going back to the evolutionary psychology stuff, or maybe I'm just getting old. I can return to old things now.
Well, there's a couple of themes here. One theme is how we judge each other's intelligence. And you get some sense when people are introducing themselves and they say, well, my degree is in X and I worked for years as Y and so on. You have proxies for intelligence. But really, our beliefs about somebody's intelligence are based on conversation. So you spend 5 minutes with somebody and you quickly make a judgment about how smart or not smart you think they are. based on their conversation. And so conversation becomes attractive as an input for AI because now, we have a familiar way of trying to assess. And in fact, because AI knows a little bit about a lot of things, in a casual conversation with a chatbot, if you didn't know it was a chatbot, you probably would rate its intelligence as at least reasonably high. So that's one thing. That conversation is a vehicle that we often use to personally assess intelligence. Another thing is that we anthropomorphize, and so if we think of the fact that human beings have more language than other species, and so when we interact with something that has a lot of language, we think, wow, this is really something, this is like a person and smart and et cetera, when it isn't. It's just a language model. So the anthropomorphizing is the second thing. And the third thing is just the mystique of technology. I mean, we'll do a little thought experiment with me. Let's say that I'm a bioengineer and I have, through selective breeding and biotechnology and everything else, I've bred a different species of parrot. And the parrot can do what chatbots do. The parrot can, have a conversation with you and kind of take the symbols that you're expressing to it and coming back with a different set of symbols that form a conversation. Would people get all excited about that and say, gee, I want that parrot writing my lesson plans. I want that parrot to, tutor me. I don't think so, because people know that parrots don't understand what they're saying. They're just mimics. But because of the mystique of technology, a technology that's just like a parrot, people are ready to get down on the ground and worship it. And it's just weird, I mean, I have to say, it's just weird and sad that people are willing to turn over major human responsibilities to something that is just a bunch of language tricks. You're muted.
I'm sorry. I just think that we're approaching an hour, but what I think this reflection actually is very helpful. It sends us to some areas we haven't talked about AI. We've been talking a lot about how to use AI. I think Punya, you brought about something really quite fascinating. So I want to just really pose a question to say where we want to go with this in the future is that the social emotional aspect of interacting with AI.
So
I can never escape from my own background. So I'm always thinking about the isolated children. They're isolated. They don't get support from parents. They don't get support from community. When they are approaching AI, have their own tool, how do they build a different social space, which is remote, which is different, distant? How do they do that? And how do they feel about the social emotional satisfaction or dissatisfaction or stimulate their imagination? So that's, I think, area I'm really kind of interested in that.
So I'll say this, right, that I don't think it is possible for us to not anthropomorphize these tools. I just don't think it's possible, right? So let's start. So there are a lot of people who, oh, we shouldn't anthropomorphize, we shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. And my thing on this is we anthropomorphize ATM machines, okay? We anthropomorphize computer interfaces, which are graphical user interfaces. We anthropomorphize a bunch of things, and there are certain principles that you can say, if a thing behaves the following way, we will anthropomorphize it. If it's slightly erratic, if it's this, if it's, and we will. And these language models are checking off a whole bunch of complicated boxes that our brains, our Stone Age brains evolved. I mean, the example I give is beavers, right? So beavers build dams. Now, beavers build dams whenever they hear the sound of water, because till ethologists came along, whenever there was the sound of water, it meant there was water. Then some animal behavior guy comes along and brings this new media called a tape recorder, where he records the sound of water and plays it for a bunch of beavers. And these guys go very industrially, start building a dam. And I think that's the analogy for us, is that we cannot help anthropomorphize these tools. And that is both a risk. To me, it's a huge risk, honestly, because as Chris is saying, there is nothing there. There is no true, genuine empathy. There is no true, genuine understanding of the world. It is a language model built on a bunch of words and their connections to each other. So I don't agree that it's a stochastic pattern. I think that it is doing some level of higher order thinking. It is totally doing that, because otherwise it wouldn't be doing some of the things that it can do. However, there is nothing there behind it. And to me, the fact that we will fall for it, its social behavior, is a very scary thing. Honestly, that's how I look at it. And I would love to talk. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been writing some about it, but I don't see many people take this stance on it, of our inherent thing. I mean, we will anthropomorphize, we will ascribe intentions. That's why when people, you should read, people talk about, oh, Bard has a different personality than Bing Chat. What does that even mean? And I know exactly what they mean. It does have a different personality. Claude is boring. Claude is boring to use. It is a boring personality. GPT-4 is smarter than GPT 3.5. I can say these words because I have no other words but intentional human psychological words to describe its actions. And so I have no choice but to it. And I think that's super interesting to me.
This is apparently a very exciting topic for Punya, at least.
Oh, very much so.
I think we're all interested in this. We will not continue this conversation. It's already 12:02. So let me
well, wait, I have a one-sentence book. And
okay,
then you
go
can
ahead.
do the next episode. Rather than have children, John decided to have 3 chatbots. That's
All
my
right.
one-sentence book. Okay, Jan, go for
fabulous
it.
book.
So that's that. No, I have a one-sentence corollary to that, but I'm going to plagiarize from Hemingway. Because he got those chatbots, the next story that he wrote was "For Sale Baby Shoes Never Used."
All right, let me thank my co-hosts, Christina and Punya Mishra. And for next episode, we will actually be talking about children. We have 2 teachers who started by listening to children, then they evolved into a nonprofit organization. So they're providing support to schools and other teachers and students to how do we have conversation, listen to students, how to make changes. This project is called the Human Restoration Project. I love this term, Human Restoration Project in schools. So we're going to have Chris McNutt and Nick Covington join us next week. We'll do this at 12 o'clock Eastern Time, noon to 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.